So here's something that might unsettle you a little, in a good way, before you fall asleep. Right now, lying wherever you are, you hold beliefs about the world. Hundreds of them. Thousands. You believe that other people have minds, that the sun will rise tomorrow, that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong, that the chair you sat in earlier today is real and solid and actually exists, even when nobody's looking at it. You believe these things so deeply, so automatically, that they don't even feel like beliefs. They feel like facts, like the furniture of reality itself. But here's the thing. Every single one of those beliefs, if you push on it hard enough, starts to wobble. Not because the beliefs are wrong, necessarily, but because when you really try to explain why you hold them, when you try to trace them back to some unshakable foundation, you discover that the ground underneath is softer than you thought. And that discovery, that vertigo you feel when the obvious turns out to be not so obvious after all, that's philosophy. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Every confusing, maddening, beautiful, brain-bending thing about it. And we're going to take it very slowly. No rush at all. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfect. Some of these ideas have been keeping people awake for 2,500 years, so it's only fitting that they should finally help someone fall asleep. We'll start at the very beginning, with a handful of strange, brilliant people standing on the shores of the Mediterranean, staring at the world around them, and asking a question so simple, it sounds almost childish. And yet that question, that one innocent question, cracked open a door that humanity has never been able to close. The question was this: what is everything made of? That's it. That's the question that started Western philosophy. And the person who asked it, or at least the first person we know of who tried to answer it with reason instead of mythology, was a man named Thales, who lived in the Greek city of Miletus, on the coast of what is now Turkey, around 600 BCE. Now Miletus was a wealthy trading port, a crossroads of cultures, the kind of place where you'd hear a dozen languages at the docks, and where new ideas traveled as freely as goods. And Thales was, by all accounts, a practical man. He was a merchant, an engineer, a mathematician. There's a famous story, possibly apocryphal, that he once predicted a solar eclipse. Another story says he figured out how to measure the height of the Egyptian pyramids by measuring their shadows. Clever guy. But what makes Thales matter for our story isn't his engineering, it's his audacity. Because before Thales, when people asked why it rained, or why earthquakes happened, or what the stars were, the answers were always mythological. Zeus threw thunderbolts. Poseidon shook the earth. The gods did it. And Thales said, essentially, no. There has to be a natural explanation, something physical, something you can reason about without invoking supernatural beings. And his answer to the big question, what is everything made of, was water. Everything, he said, is fundamentally water. The earth floats on water. Things come from water and return to water. Life needs water. Water can be solid, liquid, or vapor. It made a certain intuitive sense. Now, was he right? No, obviously not. Everything is not made of water. But that's not the point. The point is the move he made. The point is that for the first time in recorded history, someone looked at the bewildering complexity of the universe and said, I bet there's a single underlying principle that explains all of it, and I'm going to try to figure out what it is, using nothing but my own reasoning. That's extraordinary. That's the birth of philosophy and science in one breath. And here's what happened next, and this is where it starts to get interesting. Other thinkers in Miletus and nearby cities took Thales's basic approach, his insistence on natural explanations, and came up with completely different answers. Anaximander, who was probably Thales's student, said the fundamental substance wasn't water, but something he called the apeiron, the boundless or the infinite. a formless, limitless something from which all specific things emerge and to which they all return. That's a wild idea, if you think about it. He's basically saying reality at its most fundamental level is something that has no specific qualities at all, something beyond definition. It's abstract in a way that feels surprisingly modern. Then there was Anaximenes, who said everything was made of air and that different substances were just air compressed or expanded to different degrees. Heraclitus, over in Ephesus, argued that fire was the fundamental element, but what he really meant was something deeper. He's the one who said you can't step into the same river twice because the water is always changing, and so are you. For Heraclitus, the fundamental reality wasn't any substance at all. It was change itself, flux. Everything flows. Everything is always becoming something else. The only constant is inconstancy. Think about that for a second. 2,500 years ago, this man looked at the world and saw that permanence is an illusion, that everything you think is stable is actually in the middle of transforming into something else, and he made that insight the cornerstone of his entire philosophy. And then, on the other side of the Greek world, in southern Italy, there was Parmenides, and Parmenides said something that's still one of the most confusing things anyone has ever proposed in philosophy. He said, change is impossible. He argued, through pure logical reasoning, that what exists must exist, and what doesn't exist can't exist, and therefore nothing can come into being or pass away, because that would require something to come from nothing or become nothing, both of which are logically impossible. Reality, Parmenides concluded, is one, unchanging, eternal, and indivisible. Everything you see, all the motion and change and diversity in the world, is an illusion. Your senses are lying to you. Only reason can reveal the truth, and reason says nothing moves, nothing changes, nothing is born or dies. Now, you might be lying there thinking, that's obviously insane. Things clearly move, things clearly change. I watched the sun set tonight. But here's the thing about Parmenides, the reason he still matters 2.5 millennia later. His argument is logically rigorous. It's really hard to find the flaw in it without introducing some fairly sophisticated philosophical machinery. And the attempt to answer Parmenides, to figure out where his reasoning goes wrong, drove an enormous amount of subsequent Greek philosophy. Plato wrestled with it. Aristotle wrestled with it. In a way, we're still wrestling with it. The question of whether the world as we experience it is the real world, or whether there's some deeper, hidden reality behind the appearances, that question runs like a river through the entire history of philosophy. And it starts here, with Parmenides, refusing to believe his own eyes. And then there was Parmenides' student, Zeno of Elea, who is one of the most delightfully maddening figures in the whole history of philosophy. Zeno didn't just defend Parmenides' crazy-sounding view that change and motion are illusions. He attacked the alternative. He said, okay, you think motion is real? Prove it. And then he produced a series of paradoxes that seem to show that motion is logically impossible. The most famous is the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine a race between Achilles, the fastest runner in Greece, and a tortoise. The tortoise gets a head start. Now, before Achilles can catch the tortoise, he has to reach the point where the tortoise started. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved ahead a little. So now, Achilles has to reach that new point. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved again, and so on. There's always a gap, always another point to reach, always another small distance the tortoise has moved. Achilles never catches up. He gets closer and closer, but never actually arrives. Now, you know Achilles catches the tortoise in real life, obviously. But Zeno's challenge is to explain where the logical argument goes wrong. And this turns out to be surprisingly hard. The full resolution didn't come until the development of rigorous mathematical analysis in the 19th century, when mathematicians figured out how to handle infinite series and the concept of a limit. The sum of all those ever-shrinking intervals does converge to a finite value. Achilles catches the tortoise at a definite point, but for over 2,000 years, Zeno's paradoxes were genuinely troubling, and they raised deep questions about the nature of infinity, continuity, and the relationship between mathematics and physical reality that are still discussed by philosophers of mathematics today. Meanwhile, Democritus, another pre-Socratic thinker, proposed something that turned out to be astonishingly prescient. He suggested that everything is made of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms. Atomos in Greek, meaning uncuttable. These atoms come in different shapes and sizes. They move through empty space, they collide and combine and separate. And that's what produces the world we see. He was guessing, of course. He had no experimental evidence. But his guess was, in broad outline, remarkably close to what modern physics would confirm more than 2,000 years later. The universe really is made of tiny fundamental particles moving through space. Democritus just reasoned his way there with nothing but his brain. So within about 150 years, from roughly 600 to 450 BCE, these Greek thinkers had already laid out most of the fundamental positions that philosophy would spend the next 2.5 millennia exploring. Is reality fundamentally one thing or many things? Is change real or illusory? Can we trust our senses, or should we trust only our reason? Is there a hidden structure beneath the world of appearances? These aren't just ancient curiosities. These are live questions. They are genuinely unresolved, and depending on which ones you take seriously, you end up with very different pictures of what reality is and what it means to know anything about it. But all of that was, in a sense, prologue, because the person who really changed the game, who turned philosophy from a kind of cosmic speculation into something personal, something that grabbed you by the collar and demanded you examine your own life, your own beliefs, your own assumptions. That person showed up in Athens around 470 BCE. He never wrote a single word. He was considered ugly, he was famously poor, and he spent his days wandering the streets and the marketplace, asking people annoying questions. His name was Socrates, and his story is one of the most remarkable and most tragic in all of intellectual history. He was the man who claimed to know nothing, and he meant it, and the way he meant it would change everything about how human beings think about thinking itself. Because here's what Socrates did that was so revolutionary, and it sounds so simple when you describe it, that you almost wonder why it mattered so much. He asked questions. That's it. He walked up to people, important people, confident people, people who were absolutely sure they knew what justice was, or what courage was, or what the good life consisted of, and he asked them to define their terms. What do you mean by justice? Can you give me a definition that covers all cases? And when they gave him an answer, he'd find a counterexample. He'd find a case where their definition broke down, where it either included something it shouldn't or excluded something it should. And then they'd revise their definition, and he'd find another counterexample, and another, until the person he was talking to was completely tied in knots, unable to give a coherent account of something they'd been absolutely certain about 5 minutes earlier. This is the Socratic method, and it's deceptively powerful. On the surface, it looks like Socrates is just being annoying, like he's a philosophical troll who enjoys embarrassing people. And some of his contemporaries saw him that way, definitely. The comedian Aristophanes wrote a play called The Clouds that portrayed Socrates as a ridiculous figure running a school where they teach you how to make weak arguments seem strong. But what Socrates was actually doing was something much more profound. He was demonstrating that most people don't actually understand the things they think they understand. They use words like justice and courage and beauty every day, with complete confidence. But when you press them to explain what those words actually mean, to give a definition that holds up under scrutiny, they can't do it. And that gap between our confidence that we understand something and our actual ability to articulate what we understand, that gap is one of the deepest insights in all of philosophy. It's the gap that Socrates spent his entire life pointing at. Now, here's the thing about Socrates that makes him so fascinating and so hard to pin down. He never claimed to have the answers himself. That's the famous Socratic irony. When he said he knew nothing, he wasn't being humble in a false, performative way. He was making a genuine epistemological claim. He was saying that the one thing he knew, the one advantage he had over all these supposedly wise people, was that he knew he didn't know. They thought they knew what justice was, and they were wrong. At least Socrates knew he was ignorant. And that awareness of your own ignorance, Socrates argued, is the beginning of wisdom. It's the necessary starting point for any genuine inquiry. You can't learn if you think you already know. This drove people crazy. The oracle at Delphi had allegedly declared Socrates the wisest man in Athens, and Socrates spent years trying to disprove this by finding someone wiser, someone who actually knew something. He interviewed politicians, poets, craftsmen, anyone with a reputation for wisdom, and every time, he found the same thing. They didn't know what they thought they knew. They couldn't defend their beliefs under questioning, and yet they were absolutely sure they were right. Socrates concluded that the oracle had been correct after all, but only in this ironic sense. He was the wisest person in Athens because he was the only one who recognized his own ignorance. And there's a deeper point here, one that connects to something you might feel in your own life. How often do you hold opinions, strong opinions, about things you haven't really thought through? How often do you use words like freedom or fairness or happiness as though they have obvious, uncontested meanings, when in fact some of the greatest minds in history have spent their entire lives trying to figure out what those words mean and have never fully succeeded? Socrates would say that this is the human condition. We walk around in a fog of unexamined assumptions, and most of the time it doesn't matter, because the assumptions work well enough for everyday life. But every now and then, you hit a situation where the assumptions break down, where two of your deeply held beliefs contradict each other, where the thing you were sure was obviously right turns out to be tangled and ambiguous, and much harder than you thought. And in those moments, you're doing philosophy, whether you want to or not. And there's something else about Socrates that's worth mentioning, because it connects to a much bigger question about what philosophy is for. Socrates didn't charge for his teaching. He wasn't a sophist, a professional teacher of rhetoric and persuasion who trained wealthy young Athenians to win arguments in the law courts and the assembly. The sophists, people like Protagoras and Gorgias, were practical men. They taught skills that had market value. Socrates thought they were selling something dangerous, the ability to make a weak argument appear strong, without any concern for whether the argument was actually true. For Socrates, the whole point of philosophical inquiry wasn't to win arguments. It was to find the truth. And if finding the truth meant admitting that you were wrong, that was a feature, not a bug. This distinction between philosophy and rhetoric, between seeking truth and seeking persuasion, is one of the most important distinctions in all of intellectual history, and it's more relevant today than ever. In a world saturated with advertising, propaganda, political spin, and social media discourse, optimized for engagement rather than accuracy, Socrates' insistence that the goal of conversation is truth, not victory, feels almost radical. He would have been baffled by the concept of a debate where the goal is to score points rather than to understand. He would have been appalled by the idea that being persuasive is more important than being right. And yet, ironically, the very institution that killed him, the Athenian democracy, was precisely the kind of system where persuasion mattered more than truth, where the man who could speak most convincingly to a crowd of 500 jurors could condemn an innocent man to death. Socrates did all of this without writing anything down, which means everything we know about him comes from other people, mainly his student Plato, and this creates a whole other layer of philosophical confusion. When you read a Platonic dialogue, with Socrates as the main character asking all those devastating questions, how do you know which ideas are Socrates's and which are Plato's? The answer is, you don't. Not really. Scholars have been arguing about this for centuries. The early dialogues, most people agree, probably capture something close to the real Socrates. The later dialogues are almost certainly Plato using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own, increasingly elaborate philosophical system. But the boundary is blurry, and it's one of those lovely, frustrating ambiguities that philosophy just hands you and says, deal with it. What is not ambiguous is how the story ends. In 399 BCE, when Socrates was about 70 years old, he was put on trial by the city of Athens. The charges were impiety, failing to acknowledge the gods recognized by the city, and corrupting the youth. The real reasons were probably more political than religious. Athens had recently been through a traumatic period, a devastating war with Sparta, a brief and brutal oligarchic coup, the restoration of democracy. Several of the people associated with the oligarchic faction had been Socrates' students, or at least his associates. There was guilt by association. There was also the simple fact that Socrates had spent decades making powerful people look foolish in public, and powerful people tend to remember that. At his trial, Socrates was characteristically defiant. Plato's account, the Apology, portrays him as refusing to grovel, refusing to beg for mercy, refusing to stop doing exactly what he'd always done. He told the jury, essentially, that an unexamined life is not worth living, and that he would rather die than give up philosophy. The jury convicted him by a relatively narrow margin, and then, when given the chance to propose an alternative punishment, Socrates more or less dared them to execute him by suggesting that his punishment should be free meals at the public dining hall for the rest of his life, the kind of honor normally reserved for Olympic champions. The jury sentenced him to death by drinking hemlock. He had a month in prison before the sentence was carried out, and during that time, according to Plato, his friends came to visit him and offered to help him escape. The escape would have been easy, apparently. The guards were willing to look the other way. But Socrates refused. He argued that he had lived his entire life as a citizen of Athens, that he had benefited from the city's laws and institutions, and that it would be wrong to break those laws now, just because they happened to produce a result he didn't like. You can't claim the protection of the law when it suits you, and then reject the law when it doesn't. Either you accept the authority of the legal system as a whole, or you don't. And Socrates accepted it, even when it meant his own death. He drank the hemlock. Plato's description of the scene is one of the most quietly devastating passages in all of literature. Socrates walks around the cell until his legs grow heavy, then lies down. The numbness creeps up from his feet. His last words, according to Plato, were about a debt he owed. He said to his friend Crito, "We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay it." And then he was gone. The man who knew nothing, who questioned everything, who believed that the pursuit of wisdom was the highest activity a human being could engage in. Dead at 70, killed by the city he'd spent his life trying to improve. And here's the thing that makes Socrates' death more than just a sad story. It raises a philosophical question that is genuinely, stubbornly, irresolvably hard. Was Socrates right to stay and die? Should you obey an unjust law? Is there a duty to accept the verdict of a legal system even when that system has gotten it horribly wrong? If you say yes, you're endorsing the execution of an innocent man. If you say no, you're saying that individuals can pick and choose which laws to obey based on their own judgment, and that leads to its own problems. This is not an abstract question. People face versions of it every day, from civil rights activists deciding whether to break segregation laws to ordinary citizens deciding whether to follow a rule they consider unjust. And Socrates' answer, that you should obey the law even when it costs you everything, is noble and arguably insane, and has been debated for 24 centuries without resolution. That's philosophy for you. The questions it asks don't go away. But Socrates' most lasting influence wasn't his death. It was his most brilliant student. Because Plato took everything Socrates had done, all that questioning, all that demolition of false confidence, and built something new on top of it, something constructive. And the thing Plato built is one of the most ambitious, most imaginative, and most confusing intellectual structures in human history. It starts with a cave. Imagine, Plato says, a group of people who have been chained inside a cave since birth. They're facing a wall. Behind them, there's a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk back and forth, carrying objects, statues, and figures of animals and other things. The fire casts shadows of these objects on the wall that the prisoners face, and since the prisoners have never seen anything else, they think the shadows are reality. They give the shadows names. They study their patterns. They become experts in shadow behavior. As far as they're concerned, this is all there is. Now imagine one prisoner is freed. He turns around and sees the fire and the objects casting the shadows, and at first he's blinded and confused. This can't be right. The shadows were so familiar, so real. But gradually, his eyes adjust, and he realizes that what he'd been looking at his entire life were just projections, flickering imitations of something more real behind him. And then he's dragged out of the cave entirely, into the sunlight, and he sees the actual world, the real objects, the sun itself, and he understands that everything he'd believed before was a pale, distorted copy of a deeper reality. This is Plato's allegory of the cave, and it's one of the most famous thought experiments in the history of philosophy. And the question it asks is genuinely unsettling. What if we're the prisoners? What if the world we see, the world of physical objects and everyday experience, is itself just a shadow of something more real, something we can't perceive with our senses but can glimpse through reason? What if the chair you're lying on right now isn't truly real, or rather, isn't as real as you think it is? That sounds crazy. But here's how Plato's reasoning works, and it's more compelling than you might expect. Think about chairs. There are millions of chairs in the world. Wooden ones, metal ones, plastic ones, three-legged stools, beanbags, thrones. They all look completely different, and yet you recognize every single one of them as a chair. How? What is it that they all share? What is the chairness of a chair? It's not any particular physical property, because chairs come in every shape and material imaginable. It's something more abstract than that, some pattern, some essence, some form, that all chairs participate in, but that can't be reduced to any physical feature. Plato called these abstract essences forms, or ideas, with a capital F and a capital I, and he said they're more real than the physical objects that embody them. The form of a chair is eternal, unchanging, perfect. Every physical chair is a temporary, imperfect copy of that form, the way a shadow is a copy of the thing casting it. And this doesn't just apply to chairs. It applies to everything. There's a form of beauty, a form of justice, a form of equality, a form of the good. These forms exist in a higher realm, beyond the physical world, beyond space and time. They're the ultimate reality. Everything we see and touch is just a flickering shadow on the cave wall. Now, if you're thinking that sounds suspiciously like a religious worldview, you're not wrong. There's a reason Plato's philosophy had such a profound influence on Christianity. The idea of a perfect, eternal realm beyond the visible world, accessible through something higher than the senses, that maps pretty neatly onto certain theological frameworks. But Plato wasn't making a religious argument. He was making a philosophical one, based on the problem of universals, which is one of those deceptively simple puzzles that turns out to be genuinely hard. The problem is this: we group things into categories. We say this is a dog, that is a cat. This action is just, that one is unjust. But what makes those groupings possible? What is it that all dogs share? If it's not any specific physical property, then what is it? And where does it exist? Plato's answer, the forms, is one possibility, but it comes with its own problems, and Plato's greatest student was the first person to point them out systematically. Aristotle, who studied at Plato's academy in Athens for 20 years before setting off on his own extraordinary career, agreed with Plato that there's something real about universals, about the essence of dogness or justice or beauty. But he thought Plato was wrong to put them in a separate, heavenly realm. Aristotle said the forms, lowercase f in his version, exist in things, not apart from them. The essence of a dog is in every actual dog, not floating around in some platonic heaven. The universal is real, but it's realized in particular things, not separate from them. This might sound like a subtle distinction, and in a way, it is. But the consequences are enormous. Plato's philosophy pulls you upward, away from the physical world, toward abstract, eternal truths. It says the highest knowledge is contemplation of the forms, and the senses are unreliable distractions. Aristotle's philosophy pulls you back down to earth. It says the way to understand reality is to look at actual things, to observe, to classify, to study the natural world empirically. And in a sense, the entire history of Western thought is a long argument between these two impulses. Plato gave us mysticism, idealism, the sense that there's something higher and purer beyond appearances. Aristotle gave us science, empiricism, the conviction that you understand something by examining how it actually works. Both impulses are still alive today, and they still shape how people think about everything from politics to physics to the meaning of life. Aristotle himself was one of the most astonishing minds in human history. He wrote about everything: logic, physics, biology, ethics, politics, aesthetics, metaphysics, rhetoric, psychology. He invented formal logic, the system of syllogisms that governed reasoning for 2,000 years until the 19th century. He classified animals with a thoroughness that still impresses modern biologists. He wrote the Nicomachean Ethics, which argued that the good life consists of exercising virtue, which he defined as the mean between extremes. Courage, for instance, is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between miserliness and extravagance. It's an appealingly balanced picture of how to live, and it's influenced moral thinking ever since. But what Aristotle might have contributed most to philosophy is something less glamorous, but arguably more fundamental. He was the first person to really systematize the rules of valid reasoning. His logic, the theory of syllogisms, is a method for determining whether an argument is valid based purely on its structure, regardless of what it's about. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's a valid syllogism. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, not because of anything specific about Socrates or mortality, but because of the logical form of the argument. Aristotle identified all the valid forms and categorized them, and this framework dominated logic until Gottlob Frege and others developed modern symbolic logic in the late 1800s. Think about that. One man's work on the structure of reasoning held up for over 2,000 years. That's an extraordinary run. And Aristotle didn't just contribute to abstract philosophy. He was the tutor of Alexander the Great, which gives you some sense of the kind of circles he moved in. When Alexander went off to conquer the known world, Aristotle went back to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum, which rivaled Plato's academy. He'd walk around the gardens while lecturing, which is why his followers were called the Peripatetics, from the Greek word for walking around. And the body of work he produced there is almost incomprehensible in its scope. He essentially created the fields of biology, zoology, logic, metaphysics, and political science as systematic disciplines. For nearly 2,000 years, calling someone the philosopher in Europe or the Islamic world meant Aristotle. No first name needed. Everyone knew who you meant. In the Islamic Golden Age, thinkers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes preserved, translated, and expanded on Aristotle's work at a time when much of it had been lost in Western Europe. When Aristotle's writings were reintroduced to the Latin West in the 12th and 13th centuries, through Arabic translations and commentaries, they triggered an intellectual revolution. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval Christian philosopher, spent much of his career trying to reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology, producing a vast synthesis that remains the official philosophical framework of the Catholic Church. Whether that synthesis actually works, whether you can reconcile a pagan philosopher's commitment to observation and logic with a religious tradition based on faith and revelation, that's itself a philosophical question with no easy answer. But for all Aristotle's brilliance, and for all the progress the Greek philosophers made, there were questions they couldn't settle. Questions that are, if anything, even more confusing than the ones they started with. And as we move forward in time, through the Roman period and the Middle Ages, one question in particular rises to the surface and refuses to go away. It's a question that has tormented theologians, philosophers, and ordinary people for as long as anyone has believed in any kind of God. And it goes like this: if God exists, and God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, then why does evil exist? Why do innocent people suffer? Why do children get sick and die? Why do earthquakes destroy entire cities? Why is the world so full of pain? This is the problem of evil, and it is, by a wide margin, one of the most discussed problems in the entire history of philosophy. It's also, for many people, the most emotionally charged. Because it's not just an abstract puzzle. It's the question you ask at 3 a.m, when something terrible has happened, when the world seems broken and cruel, and you can't understand why a supposedly loving God would allow it. The logical structure of the problem is deceptively clean. You have 3 propositions. God is omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, able to do anything. God is omniscient, meaning all-knowing, aware of all suffering. God is omnibenevolent, meaning perfectly good, wanting to prevent suffering. And evil exists. These 4 statements, taken together, seem to form a contradiction. If God knows about suffering, has the power to stop it, and wants to stop it, then suffering shouldn't exist. But it does. So at least one of those 3 properties must be false. Either God isn't all-powerful, or God isn't all-knowing, or God isn't all-good, or God doesn't exist at all. Attempts to solve this problem are called theodicies, and there have been many of them over the centuries. One of the most influential was proposed by St. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. Augustine argued that evil isn't a thing in itself. It's not a substance or a force. It's an absence, a privation of good, the way darkness is the absence of light, and cold is the absence of heat. Evil enters the world through free will. God gave human beings the ability to choose, and some humans choose badly. That's not God's fault, it's theirs. And a world with free will, even one that includes the possibility of evil, is better than a world of mere automata, beings who do good only because they have no choice. That's a powerful argument, and it has real force. But it doesn't answer everything. What about natural evil? Earthquakes, diseases, tsunamis. Nobody chose those. They're not the result of anyone's free will. Augustine would say they're consequences of the original fall, of humanity's first disobedience, corrupting the whole of nature. But that explanation requires a very specific theological framework, and even within that framework, it raises uncomfortable questions. Should children suffer because of a sin committed by their most distant ancestors? Is that really compatible with a perfectly good God? Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the great German philosopher and mathematician, who also co-invented calculus, took a different approach in the early 1700s. He argued that this is the best of all possible worlds, not the best imaginable world, but the best world that could actually exist, given all the constraints of logical consistency and the balance of good and evil. God, being omniscient, surveyed every possible universe and chose the one that maximized goodness. Some evil is necessary, because without it, certain greater goods wouldn't be possible. Without the possibility of suffering, there would be no compassion. Without the possibility of failure, there would be no courage. The universe is an optimal package, and we, with our limited perspective, can't see why every piece of suffering is necessary, but God can. Voltaire found this argument so absurd that he wrote an entire novel making fun of it. Candide, published in 1759, follows a naive young man whose tutor keeps insisting that everything is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, while one catastrophe after another befalls them: earthquakes, wars, slavery, disease. It's savagely funny and deeply humane, and it captures something important about the problem of evil. Philosophical arguments, no matter how clever, can feel inadequate in the face of actual, concrete suffering. You can construct the most elegant theodicy in the world, but if you're standing in the rubble of an earthquake that killed 10,000 people, the words ring hollow. The problem of evil isn't just a logical puzzle, it's an existential wound, and yet the question doesn't go away. If anything, it gets more complicated as you think about it, because it's entangled with another question that is just as confusing and just as unavoidable: the question of free will. And free will is one of those topics where the harder you think about it, the less certain you become about something you were absolutely sure of 5 minutes ago. Let me ask you something. Do you believe you have free will? Most people say yes, immediately, confidently. Of course I have free will. I chose to listen to this. I chose to lie down. I could have done something else. Every moment is full of choices, and I'm the one making them. But here's the problem. If the universe is governed by physical laws, and your brain is a physical object, then your thoughts and decisions are the result of physical processes: neurons firing, chemicals flowing, electrical signals propagating, all of which are governed by the same laws of physics that govern everything else. And if every physical event is determined by prior physical causes, stretching back in an unbroken chain to the beginning of the universe, then your decision to listen to this tonight was determined by the state of your brain, which was determined by everything that happened to your brain before this moment, which was determined by everything that happened before that, all the way back to the Big Bang. In which case, you didn't really choose anything. You just think you did. This is the problem of determinism, and it's been haunting philosophy since the ancient Stoics and Epicureans argued about it in the centuries after Aristotle. If everything that happens is the inevitable result of what happened before, then free will is an illusion. But if free will is an illusion, then moral responsibility seems to collapse too. How can you blame someone for doing something they couldn't have avoided doing? How can you punish a criminal if their crime was determined by factors beyond their control? Their genes, their upbringing, the precise arrangement of atoms in their brain at the moment of decision. Now, some philosophers have tried to rescue free will by arguing that it's compatible with determinism. This position is called compatibilism, and it's actually the most popular view among professional philosophers today. The compatibilist says, look, free will doesn't mean you could have done otherwise in some deep metaphysical sense. It means you acted according to your own desires and reasons, without being coerced or constrained by external forces. You wanted to listen to this, nobody held a gun to your head, so you freely chose it, even if your wanting was itself determined by prior causes. Free will, on this view, isn't about escaping the causal chain. It's about a certain kind of relationship between your actions and your internal states. Other philosophers find this deeply unsatisfying. They say compatibilism is just relabeling the problem, defining free will in a way that makes it compatible with determinism by stripping out everything that actually matters about freedom. If your desires themselves are determined, if you couldn't have desired otherwise, then in what meaningful sense did you freely choose? The incompatibilists say either determinism is true and free will doesn't exist, or free will exists, and something about the deterministic picture is wrong. And here's where it gets really weird. Some people have tried to use quantum mechanics to rescue free will. You might remember that quantum physics says certain events at the subatomic level are genuinely random, not determined by prior causes. So maybe, the argument goes, the brain exploits this quantum randomness to introduce genuine indeterminacy into decision-making, and that's where free will lives. But there's a problem with this too. Randomness isn't the same as freedom. If your decisions are determined by the random decay of a radioactive atom, that doesn't make you free. It makes you random. And random is no better than determined if what you want is the sense that you, the conscious agent, are genuinely the author of your choices. So you've got three options, none of them entirely comfortable. Determinism. Everything is caused. Free will is an illusion. And moral responsibility is a convenient fiction. Libertarian free will, in the philosophical sense, not the political one, which says the will is somehow exempt from physical causation. But nobody can explain how that works without invoking something mysterious and unscientific. Or compatibilism, which redefines free will in a way that saves the concept but arguably empties it. Pick your poison. Philosophers have been picking for centuries, and none of the options has won. This is the kind of question that sits at the intersection of philosophy, physics, neuroscience, and law, and it matters in very practical ways. Every criminal justice system in the world is built on assumptions about free will and moral responsibility. If those assumptions are wrong, if people really can't help what they do, then punishment starts to look less like justice and more like vengeance. Some legal scholars and neuroscientists have argued exactly this, that our growing understanding of the brain is undermining the philosophical foundations of the legal system. Others push back, saying that even if determinism is true, society still needs mechanisms of accountability to function. The debate goes on. But let's move forward in time, because we've been dwelling in the ancient and medieval world, and there's a figure in the 17th century who really detonated the foundations of everything we've been talking about. A man who sat alone in a cold room, probably in Germany, during the winter of 1619, and decided to doubt everything. Literally everything. His name was René Descartes, and what he did that winter set the agenda for modern philosophy in a way that almost nobody else has matched. Descartes was a French mathematician, philosopher, and scientist, born in 1596 into a minor noble family. He was educated by Jesuits, traveled widely as a young man, served briefly in various armies, more as an observer and gentleman than as a soldier, and eventually settled in the Netherlands, where the intellectual climate was freer than in France. He was restless, brilliant, and intensely private. He didn't publish his most important work until he was over 40, partly because he was genuinely afraid of the consequences. Galileo had been condemned by the Church in 1633, and Descartes, who held similar views about the Earth moving around the Sun, decided to suppress his own physics treatise, rather than risk the same fate. But the work he did publish changed everything. In 1641, he wrote the Meditations on First Philosophy, and the central move of that book is one of the most famous philosophical gambits ever attempted. Descartes decided to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted, to strip away every belief that wasn't absolutely, unshakably certain, to find the one thing, if such a thing existed, that he couldn't doubt no matter how hard he tried, and he would rebuild all of knowledge from that single, certain foundation. So what can you doubt? Well, pretty much everything, it turns out. Your senses can deceive you. You've had experiences where things weren't what they appeared. A stick looks bent in water. A distant tower looks round when it's actually square. You've dreamed vivid dreams that seemed completely real while you were in them. How do you know you're not dreaming right now? Seriously, how do you know? You feel the weight of the blankets. You hear these words. Everything seems real. But it seemed real in your dreams too, and you were wrong then. What if you're wrong now? Descartes pushes even further. What about mathematics? 2 + 3 = 5. That seems absolutely certain, doesn't it? But what if there's an evil demon, a malicious, all-powerful deceiver, who is feeding you false experiences and false beliefs at every moment, who has arranged things so that even your most basic logical intuitions are wrong? You might think that's paranoid, and it is, deliberately so. Descartes is constructing the most extreme skeptical scenario he can imagine. If he can find something that survives even this, he'll have found genuinely certain knowledge. And he does find it. He finds one thing that he cannot doubt, no matter how powerful the evil demon is. He cannot doubt that he himself exists. Because even if the demon is deceiving him about everything else, the act of being deceived requires someone to be deceived. Even if he's wrong about every single thing he believes, the fact that he's thinking, even if all his thoughts are false, proves that there's a thinking thing, a mind, a self. This is the famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It's often presented as a logical argument, but Descartes intended it more as an intuition, a direct, immediate certainty that you grasp in the very act of doubting. Now, here's the thing about the cogito. It's extraordinarily powerful as a starting point, but it's also extraordinarily narrow. All it tells you is that you exist as a thinking thing. It doesn't tell you that you have a body. It doesn't tell you that the external world is real. It doesn't tell you that other people exist. You're left with absolute certainty about one thing, your own mind, and complete uncertainty about everything else. And getting from there back to the world, rebuilding all of knowledge on this tiny foundation, turns out to be fiendishly difficult. Descartes tried. He argued that because he has a clear and distinct idea of God as a perfect being, God must exist, because existence is a perfection, and a perfect being wouldn't deceive him about the reality of the external world. Most subsequent philosophers have found this argument unconvincing, to put it politely. But the problem Descartes identified, the problem of how we get from the privacy of our own minds to knowledge of the external world, that problem has never been fully solved. It's still with us. And Descartes introduced another problem that's arguably even more confusing: the mind-body problem. If the cogito shows you that you are fundamentally a thinking thing, a mind, and if the external world, including your body, is known only indirectly, through the senses, then what exactly is the relationship between your mind and your body? Descartes said they're two completely different kinds of substance. The mind is non-physical, unextended, thinking. The body is physical, extended in space, not thinking. This is called substance dualism, and it has an immediate, intuitive appeal. Your mind does feel different from your body. Your thoughts, your experiences, your feelings, they don't seem to be the same kind of thing as muscles and bones and neurons. There's something about the redness of red, about the pain of a headache, about the feeling of being you, that seems fundamentally different from anything you could describe in purely physical terms. But dualism creates an enormous puzzle. If mind and body are completely different substances, how do they interact? How does your decision to raise your arm, a mental event, cause your arm to go up, a physical event? How does stubbing your toe, a physical event, cause pain, a mental event? Descartes famously suggested the pineal gland as the point of interaction, a tiny structure in the center of the brain where the soul supposedly communicates with the body. But that doesn't solve the problem. It just moves it. How does the non-physical soul interact with the physical pineal gland? You still need an explanation for how two completely different kinds of substance can causally influence each other, and nobody, including Descartes, has ever provided a satisfying one. This is the mind-body problem, and it has haunted philosophy ever since. Subsequent thinkers tried different solutions. The occasionalists, like Nicolas Malebranche, said mind and body don't actually interact at all. Instead, God intervenes at every moment, coordinating mental and physical events like a cosmic puppeteer. When you decide to raise your arm, God makes your arm go up. When you stub your toe, God creates the sensation of pain. It's an elegant solution in a way, but it requires God to be working overtime, constantly mediating between two realms that can't touch each other, and most people found it deeply unsatisfying. Spinoza, the great Dutch Jewish philosopher who was excommunicated from his synagogue for his radical views, took an even more dramatic approach. He said there aren't two substances at all. There's only one substance, which he identified with God or nature, and mind and body are just two different aspects of this single reality, the way a coin has two sides but is still one object. This is a form of monism, and it's intellectually tidy, but it raises its own problems. If everything is one substance, how do you explain the apparent difference between the mental and the physical? Spinoza's answer is subtle and difficult, and 200 years later, it influenced Einstein, who reportedly said his God was the God of Spinoza, a God identical with the orderly harmony of what exists, not a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings. The mind-body problem is, without exaggeration, one of the hardest problems in all of philosophy. It's hard enough that some philosophers think it might be unsolvable, that the human mind might simply not be equipped to understand how consciousness relates to the physical world. Others think the problem is an illusion created by confused concepts, that once we understand consciousness properly, the puzzle will dissolve. And still others think the answer lies in science, that neuroscience will eventually explain consciousness in physical terms, the same way chemistry explained life in physical terms. But right now, in the 21st century, we don't have that explanation. We have incredibly detailed knowledge of the brain. We can map neural pathways, measure neurotransmitter levels, watch regions of the brain light up during different mental activities. But we still can't explain why any of that physical activity is accompanied by subjective experience. Why does it feel like something to be you? Why doesn't the brain just process information in the dark, without any inner experience at all. That's the hard problem of consciousness, and we'll come back to it later, because it's one of the most fascinating puzzles in contemporary philosophy. But first, let's follow the thread that Descartes started, because his work kicked off an argument that dominated philosophy for the next 200 years, and that's still going on today. It's the argument between rationalism and empiricism, between the people who said knowledge comes primarily from reason and the people who said it comes primarily from experience. The rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, emphasized the power of pure thinking. They believed that certain fundamental truths about reality could be known through reason alone, without any input from the senses. Mathematical truths, logical truths, and some metaphysical truths were, they argued, accessible to the mind independently of experience. Your senses can fool you, but reason, when properly exercised, gives you certainty. The empiricists, mainly British thinkers, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume, pushed back hard. They said, the mind at birth is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and all knowledge comes from experience. You can't know anything about the world just by thinking. You have to look, touch, taste, measure, observe. Reason can arrange and analyze what experience provides, but without experience, reason has nothing to work with. And of all the empiricists, the one who pushed the argument to its most alarming conclusion, the one who woke Immanuel Kant from what Kant himself called his dogmatic slumber, was David Hume. And Hume is one of those figures who, the more you think about what he actually said, the more unsettling it gets. Hume was Scottish, born in Edinburgh in 1711, and by all accounts, he was one of the most pleasant people in the history of philosophy, which is saying something, because philosophers are not generally known for being pleasant. He was genial, sociable, a good cook, a loyal friend. Voltaire called him a true philosopher, more for his temperament than his arguments. But his arguments were devastating, because Hume looked at some of our most basic beliefs about the world, beliefs so fundamental that nobody even thinks to question them, and showed that they can't be rationally justified. The most famous example is causation. You believe that the future will resemble the past. You believe that the sun will rise tomorrow because it rose today, and yesterday, and every day before that. You believe that when you drop a ball, it will fall, because it's always fallen before. You believe in cause and effect. When one billiard ball strikes another, the second one moves. The first event causes the second. We see this so constantly that it feels like an iron law of nature. Hume says, look more carefully. What do you actually observe? You see one ball move toward another. You see contact. You see the second ball move. But do you see the causation? Do you observe some invisible force or power flowing from the first ball to the second? No. You see one event followed by another event. That's it. You infer the causation. You project it onto the events based on past experience. But the connection itself is never observed. And here's the really uncomfortable part. Hume asks, what justifies your belief that past experience is a reliable guide to the future? Why do you believe that because A has always been followed by B in the past, A will be followed by B in the future? The only possible justification would be some principle like, nature is uniform, the future will resemble the past. But how do you know that? From experience? That's circular. You'd be using past experience to justify the assumption that past experience is reliable. You'd be assuming the very thing you're trying to prove. This is Hume's problem of induction, and it is, no exaggeration, one of the most important unsolved problems in the philosophy of science. Every scientific theory, every prediction, every law of nature relies on induction, on the assumption that patterns observed in the past will continue in the future. And Hume showed that this assumption can't be rationally justified. Not because it's wrong, mind you. The sun probably will rise tomorrow. Gravity probably will keep working. But the belief that it will is a habit of mind, a psychological reflex, not a logical certainty. We believe in causation and induction because our brains are wired to see patterns and project them forward, not because reason demands it. Think about how radical that is. Hume isn't just making an obscure philosophical point. He's saying that the foundation of all scientific knowledge is, strictly speaking, unjustifiable by reason. Science works. It works spectacularly well. But Hume is telling us that we can't prove it will keep working. The best we can say is that it's always worked before, and we have a deep psychological compulsion to assume it will keep working. And that's good enough for practical purposes. But it's not certainty. It's not proof. It's faith, in a sense. Not religious faith, but a faith in the regularity of nature that can't be grounded in anything more fundamental than itself. And Hume went further. He applied the same skeptical razor to the self. You believe you have a persistent identity, a self that endures through time. You were you yesterday. You're you today. You'll be you tomorrow. But Hume asks, what do you actually experience when you look for this self? You find particular sensations, memories, thoughts, feelings. But you never find the self itself, the thing that supposedly has all these experiences. The self, Hume argued, is just a bundle of perceptions, a constantly changing stream of experiences, with no fixed core. There is no enduring you behind the flux. You're a process, not a thing. And that is, honestly, one of the most disorienting ideas in all of Western philosophy. It anticipates Buddhist philosophy, which reached similar conclusions about the self thousands of years earlier by very different methods, and it raises questions about personal identity that neuroscience is still grappling with today. If every atom in your body is replaced over the course of about 7 years, and your memories are constantly being rewritten and revised, in what sense are you the same person you were a decade ago? Hume would say, you're not really. You're a new bundle of perceptions that happens to be causally connected to an earlier one. And Hume's contribution to moral philosophy was equally radical. He argued that morality is not based on reason at all. Reason can tell you what is the case, but it cannot tell you what ought to be the case. Moral judgments, Hume said, come from sentiment, from feeling, from the emotions of approval and disapproval that we naturally experience when we contemplate certain actions. You see someone being kind, and you feel warmth, approval. You see someone being cruel, and you feel revulsion, condemnation. Those feelings are the foundation of morality, not some abstract rational principle. Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, he wrote, in one of the most controversial sentences in the history of moral philosophy. This is the kind of insight that makes philosophers either love Hume or want to throw things at him. And the person who had the most productive reaction to Hume's challenge was Immanuel Kant. And Kant's response is one of the most ambitious and most confusing philosophical projects ever attempted. It's the kind of thing that makes graduate students cry. But the basic idea, once you see it, is genuinely brilliant. Kant was a German philosopher, born in 1724 in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, in what was then Prussia. He was a small, fastidious man who never married, never traveled more than about 50 miles from his hometown, and was so regular in his daily walk that legend says the citizens of Königsberg could set their clocks by him. He was meticulous, systematic, and ferociously intelligent, and in 1781, when he was 57 years old, he published The Critique of Pure Reason, a book of such density and difficulty that even professional philosophers find it grueling. But the central insight, once you dig it out, is this. Hume was right that we can't derive causation or any other substantial knowledge about the world from experience alone. But he was also right that we can't derive it from pure reason alone, the way the rationalists wanted. So where does it come from? Kant's answer is that the structure comes from us, from the human mind itself. Our minds don't passively receive experience. They actively structure it. Space, time, causation, these aren't features of the world as it is in itself. They're the framework that our minds impose on experience in order to make it intelligible. We can't experience anything except through these mental structures, which is why they seem so certain, so universal, so inescapable. They're not properties of reality. They're properties of human cognition. Think about what that means. You can never know the world as it is in itself, the thing Kant called the noumenon, the thing behind the appearances. You can only know the world as it appears to you, structured by the categories of your own mind, the phenomenon. Space isn't out there. Time isn't out there. Causation isn't out there, at least not in any way you could ever verify. They're the lenses through which you see, and you can never take the lenses off to see what things look like without them. This is Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus showed that the Earth goes around the sun rather than the other way around, Kant showed that experience conforms to the mind rather than the mind conforming to experience. And it's a solution to Hume's problem in a way. We can be certain that every event we experience will have a cause, not because causation is a feature of reality in itself, but because causation is a necessary structure of human experience. We can't experience an uncaused event because our minds won't let us. Whether causation exists independent of human minds, well, that's a question we can't answer. We're stuck behind the lenses. Now, Kant's framework has enormous implications that are still being worked out. If space and time are forms of human intuition rather than features of reality in itself, then what is reality in itself like? Kant said we can't know. The thing in itself, the Ding an sich, is forever beyond our reach. We're trapped in the world of appearances, the world as filtered through our cognitive apparatus. And this is both humbling and liberating. It's humbling because it means we can never have absolute knowledge of ultimate reality. It's liberating because it means that within the world of experience, within the domain of phenomena, we can have genuine, reliable knowledge. Science works because it describes the phenomenal world, the world as structured by our minds. It doesn't need to describe the noumenal world to be valid. This might sound abstract, but it connects to something you experience every day. You know that your perception of the world is not the world itself. You know that color, for instance, is not a property of objects, but a product of your visual system's interaction with light. A colorblind person sees the same objects differently. An insect with different photoreceptors sees the world in entirely different colors. The apple isn't red. Your brain constructs redness from the wavelength of light the apple reflects. Kant is generalizing this insight to all of experience. Everything you perceive, space, time, objects, causes, is a construction of your mind's interaction with something, but the something is forever unknown. Kant didn't just reshape metaphysics and epistemology. He also proposed one of the most influential ethical theories in history. His moral philosophy centers on something called the categorical imperative, which is Kant's attempt to ground morality in pure reason, rather than in consequences or feelings or divine commands. And the basic idea is this: an action is morally right if, and only if, you could rationally will that the principle behind your action become a universal law, a rule that everyone follows. So if you're thinking about lying, You ask yourself, could I rationally will that everyone lie whenever it suits them? No, because if everyone lied, language itself would collapse. Nobody would believe anything anyone said, and lying would become pointless. The very concept of lying depends on a background of truth-telling. So lying is irrational, and therefore immoral, according to Kant. This is powerful. It gives you a purely rational test for moral rightness that doesn't depend on consequences, which are always uncertain, or on feelings, which vary from person to person. But it's also extremely rigid. Kant seems to be saying that lying is always wrong, even if you're lying to a murderer who's at your door, asking where your friend is hiding. And Kant, when asked about exactly this scenario, said yes, you should tell the truth, even then. Most people find that deeply counterintuitive, and it's one of the reasons Kant's ethics, while enormously influential, has also been enormously controversial. There's something admirable about the absolute consistency of it, and something alarming about where that consistency leads. The main rival to Kantian ethics, at least in the modern Western tradition, is utilitarianism, which was developed primarily by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the 18th and 19th centuries. And utilitarianism takes the exact opposite approach. Instead of asking whether your action is based on a universalizable principle, utilitarianism asks a much simpler question. Does your action produce the greatest amount of happiness or the least amount of suffering for the greatest number of people? Morality, on this view, is entirely about consequences. The right action is the one that maximizes well-being. This sounds wonderfully practical and clear-headed, and in many cases it is. Utilitarianism has been enormously influential in public policy, in economics, in the design of institutions. When a government decides how to allocate healthcare resources, or whether to build a highway through a neighborhood, or how to structure a tax system, utilitarian reasoning is almost always part of the calculation, even if it's not explicitly acknowledged. Maximize benefit, minimize harm. What could be simpler? But utilitarianism has its own uncomfortable implications. Here's a thought experiment that captures the problem. Imagine there's a healthy person in a hospital waiting room, and in the operating rooms beyond, 5 patients are each dying because they need a different organ transplant: a heart, a liver, 2 kidneys, and a pair of lungs. A strictly utilitarian calculation would say you should kill the one healthy person, harvest their organs, and save the 5. 5 lives saved at the cost of 1. The math is clear, but almost everyone recoils from that conclusion. It seems monstrous. It violates something deep in our moral intuitions, something about the rights of individuals, about the wrongness of using people merely as means to an end, which is, you might notice, very Kantian. And this is the tension that runs through all of moral philosophy. Do consequences matter most, or do principles? Are there things that are wrong regardless of how much good they produce? Or is morality always, ultimately, about outcomes? The most famous version of this kind of dilemma is the trolley problem, introduced by the philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and developed further by Judith Jarvis Thomson. You've probably heard some version of it. A runaway trolley is heading toward 5 people tied to the tracks. You can pull a lever to divert the trolley onto a side track, where it will kill 1 person instead. Most people say yes, pull the lever. 1 death is better than 5. But now change the scenario slightly. You're standing on a bridge above the tracks. The trolley is heading toward 5 people. Next to you is a very large man. If you push him off the bridge and onto the tracks, his body will stop the trolley and save the 5. But he will die. The utilitarian calculation is the same. 1 life for 5. But most people say no, you shouldn't push the man. even though the outcome is identical. Why? What's the difference? The trolley problem has spawned an enormous literature, thousands of pages of philosophical analysis, because it captures something genuinely puzzling about human moral intuition. We seem to operate with multiple moral systems simultaneously. A consequentialist system that evaluates outcomes, a deontological system that evaluates actions based on principles and rules, and maybe a virtue-based system that asks what a good person would do. These systems often agree, but when they conflict, we get confused, and the trolley problem is designed to make them conflict. What makes the trolley problem so enduring isn't the specific scenario, which is obviously contrived. It's the way it exposes the fault lines in our moral thinking. In everyday life, we move between consequentialist and deontological reasoning constantly, without even noticing. When you calculate whether it's worth driving an hour to save $50 on a purchase, you're thinking like a consequentialist. When you refuse to cheat on a test, even though you know you won't get caught, you're thinking like a deontologist. Most of the time, these different modes of moral reasoning agree, and you don't notice the tension. But when they disagree, when doing the right thing in one framework means doing the wrong thing in another, you're stuck, and the trolley problem is designed to put you exactly at that stuck point. And there are even more disturbing variants. In the transplant case, you're a doctor with 5 dying patients who each need a different organ. A healthy man walks into your waiting room for a checkup. Should you kill him and harvest his organs to save the 5? The utilitarian math is the same as the trolley lever case. 5 lives versus 1. But almost everyone says no, absolutely not. That would be monstrous. And explaining exactly why it's different, in a principled way that doesn't just appeal to gut feeling, turns out to be extraordinarily difficult. Philosophers have proposed all kinds of distinctions between killing and letting die, between intending harm and foreseeing it as a side effect, between using someone as a means and merely redirecting a threat. Each distinction captures something real, and each one has cases where it breaks down. And here's the really interesting thing. Neuroscientists have studied what happens in the brain when people consider these dilemmas, and they've found that different scenarios activate different brain regions. The impersonal dilemma, pulling the lever, activates areas associated with rational calculation. The personal dilemma, pushing the man, activates areas associated with emotion, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in social and emotional processing. So the conflict isn't just philosophical, it's neurological. Different parts of your brain are literally disagreeing with each other about what's right. This is fascinating, but it doesn't settle the philosophical question. Just because our moral intuitions have a neural basis doesn't mean they're correct. Maybe the emotional response is a bias we should override. Maybe the rational calculation is too cold and needs the emotional check. The science tells us how we actually make moral judgments. It doesn't tell us how we should make them. And that distinction between is and ought, between how things are and how they should be, is itself one of the foundational insights of philosophy, identified by Hume way back in the 18th century. You can't derive an ought from an is. You can't get moral conclusions from factual premises alone. The fact that something is natural doesn't make it right. The fact that something is common doesn't make it good. There's always a gap between description and prescription, and that gap is where moral philosophy lives. Now, all of this, the problem of evil, free will, the nature of knowledge, the foundations of morality, all of it assumes a certain kind of framework. It assumes that life has some kind of structure, some kind of meaning, that there are answers to be found if you just think hard enough. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, a wave of thinkers came along who challenged that assumption itself. They asked the most unsettling question of all. What if there are no answers? What if life has no inherent meaning? What if the universe is indifferent to your existence, and all the meaning you think you see is something you've projected onto a blank and uncaring void? This is existentialism, and the story of how it emerged is one of the great intellectual dramas of modern history. And it starts, as so many things do, with a strange, intense, deeply unhappy Danish man named Søren Kierkegaard, writing furiously in Copenhagen in the 1840s. Kierkegaard is often called the father of existentialism, even though the term itself wasn't coined until about a century after he wrote. He was a peculiar figure, by almost any standard. He was born in 1813 into a wealthy but psychologically tormented family. His father, a deeply religious man, was convinced that God had cursed the family, and several of Kierkegaard's siblings died young, which seemed to confirm the curse. Søren himself was physically slight, apparently walked with an odd gait, and was mercilessly mocked in the Danish press, which ran caricatures of him constantly. He was engaged to a woman named Regine Olsen, loved her deeply, and then broke off the engagement in a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He never fully explained why, though his writings hint that he felt the demands of his philosophical and religious mission were incompatible with the demands of a normal domestic life. What Kierkegaard saw with extraordinary clarity was that the grand philosophical systems of his time, particularly the massive, all-encompassing system built by G.W.F. Hegel, had completely lost touch with the reality of individual human existence. Hegel had constructed an elaborate philosophical framework in which all of history, all of thought, all of reality was the unfolding of a single rational principle, the absolute spirit, working itself out through a dialectical process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It was grand, it was systematic, it was impressive, and Kierkegaard thought it was a fraud, not because the logic was wrong, but because it had nothing to say to an actual person, standing here, right now, facing a real choice, terrified, uncertain, alone. Kierkegaard's point was that existence precedes any system. You don't live inside a philosophical framework. You live inside your own skin, making decisions under conditions of radical uncertainty, feeling anxiety and dread and hope and despair, and no amount of abstract reasoning can eliminate the fundamental aloneness of that experience. The most important questions in life: what should I believe? How should I live? What kind of person should I be? These can't be answered by consulting a system. They can only be answered by you, individually, through a leap of faith, a personal commitment that goes beyond anything reason can justify. This is the existentialist emphasis on subjectivity, on the irreducible firstness of individual experience. And it was revolutionary, because the entire tradition of Western philosophy, from Plato through Hegel, had been trying to get beyond the subjective to reach objective truths that were true for everyone, everywhere, regardless of individual perspective. Kierkegaard said no. The most important truths are subjective. Truth is subjectivity, he wrote, and he meant that the truths that matter most, the truths about how to live, are truths that you have to live, not just think. You can't outsource the meaning of your life to a philosophical system. You have to create it yourself. Now, Kierkegaard was a deeply Christian thinker. His leap of faith was specifically a leap into religious belief. But the existentialist tradition he inaugurated quickly moved beyond Christianity, and the person who pushed it furthest from its religious roots was Friedrich Nietzsche, who is probably the most misunderstood philosopher in history. Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Saxony, the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when Friedrich was 4. He was a brilliant student, appointed to a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel at the absurdly young age of 24. but his health was terrible throughout his life. He suffered from migraines, stomach problems, and near blindness. He resigned his professorship at 34 and spent the next decade wandering through Switzerland, Italy, and France, living frugally, writing furiously, and becoming increasingly isolated. In January 1889, he collapsed on a street in Turin, reportedly after throwing his arms around the neck of a horse that was being beaten, and spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of mental incapacity. He died in 1900. And during his lucid years, he produced some of the most explosive, provocative, and misappropriated philosophy ever written. The thing Nietzsche is most famous for, the declaration "God is dead," is almost always quoted out of context. Nietzsche was not celebrating, he was diagnosing. He was saying that in European civilization, the traditional foundations of meaning, the Christian God, the belief in an afterlife, the idea of a divinely ordered moral universe, these were no longer credible to intellectually honest people. Science, historical criticism, and philosophical skepticism had undermined them, and that left a void, a terrifying, yawning void where the meaning of life used to be. Because here's the thing, if God doesn't exist, if there is no cosmic plan, no afterlife, no divine judge, then all the moral and spiritual frameworks built on those assumptions come crashing down. Why be good? Because God commands it? But God is dead. Because it leads to happiness? Maybe. But there's no guarantee. Because it's rational? Kant tried that. But Nietzsche thought Kant's categorical imperative was just Christianity in disguise, the same old morality with a secular coat of paint. Without God, Nietzsche argued, we need to create new values from scratch. We need to become, as he put it, the overman, the person who creates their own meaning in a meaningless world, who says yes to life with all its suffering and absurdity, who doesn't need the crutch of religion or tradition to find purpose. Nietzsche also proposed something called the will to power, which is one of his most misunderstood ideas. It's been interpreted as a glorification of brute domination, and the Nazis notoriously co-opted Nietzsche's philosophy to justify their own ideology, largely through the selective editing of his sister Elizabeth, who was a genuine anti-Semite and who controlled his literary estate after his mental collapse. But Nietzsche himself despised anti-Semitism and nationalism. The will to power, as he understood it, wasn't about political power or military conquest. It was about self-overcoming, about the drive to grow, to create, to become more than you are. An artist wrestling with a canvas is expressing the will to power. A scientist pushing past a conceptual barrier is expressing it. Anyone who strives to master themselves, to transcend their limitations, to create something new and valuable, is expressing the will to power. It's the opposite of mere domination. It's the instinct for excellence. And Nietzsche's analysis of morality itself was ruthlessly historical. He argued, in his book On the Genealogy of Morals, that the moral values we take for granted, humility, compassion, meekness, self-denial, these aren't timeless truths. They're the products of a specific historical process. He called it slave morality, and he traced its origins to the resentment of the weak against the strong. The ancient aristocratic virtues, pride, strength, beauty, nobility, were inverted by those who lacked them. The weak couldn't overcome the strong, so they redefined the terms. They declared strength evil and weakness good. They made humility a virtue and pride a sin. And this inversion, Nietzsche argued, became so deeply embedded in Western culture, particularly through Christianity, that we can't even see it as an inversion anymore. We think it's just the way morality is. Whether you agree with this analysis or not, and many people find it deeply troubling, it forces you to ask an uncomfortable question. Are the moral values you hold actually good, or are they just the ones you happen to inherit? This is exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. And Nietzsche knew it was terrifying. He didn't pretend that the death of God was a simple liberation. He understood that most people, faced with the void, would fall into nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, that everything is permitted, that life is meaningless and might as well be abandoned. He spent much of his career trying to find a path between the collapsing old values and the abyss of nihilism. Whether he succeeded is still hotly debated. And then there's Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence, which is one of the most mind-bending thought experiments in all of philosophy. Imagine, Nietzsche says, that you will live this exact life, with every joy and every pain, every triumph and every humiliation, again and again, infinitely, forever. Nothing changes, no lessons learned, just this life, repeated for eternity. Could you bear it? Could you embrace it? Could you love your life so completely that the thought of reliving it forever fills you not with horror, but with joy? Nietzsche offered this not as a cosmological theory, but as a test of your relationship to your own existence. If the thought of eternal recurrence makes you despair, then you haven't yet found the right way to live. If you can say yes to it, then you've achieved something extraordinary. It's worth pausing on that for a moment. Lying here, at the end of a day, thinking about your life, would you want to live it again, exactly as it was? That's a profound question, and it's the kind of question philosophy is uniquely good at asking. Not because there's a right answer, but because the asking itself reveals something important about how you feel about your own existence. After Nietzsche, the existentialist tradition flowered in the 20th century, particularly in France. Jean-Paul Sartre, born in 1905, became the most publicly visible existentialist philosopher, partly because of his philosophy and partly because of his extraordinary personal life. He was a chain-smoking, cafe-haunting Parisian intellectual who had a lifelong open relationship with the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, wrote novels and plays as well as philosophy, and managed to be simultaneously a celebrity, a political activist, and a serious thinker. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964 and refused it, on the grounds that a writer should not allow himself to be turned into an institution. Sartre's most famous philosophical claim is that existence precedes essence, and here's what that means. For Descartes and the philosophical tradition going back to Plato, things have essences, natures, that define what they are. A knife has the essence of cutting. A chair has the essence of being sat upon. These essences precede the existence of any particular knife or chair, because the maker had the concept in mind before creating the object. And in the traditional view, humans are the same. God, or nature, or reason, has given human beings an essence, a human nature, and your job is to fulfill that nature, to become what you already essentially are. Sartre says no, humans don't have a pre-given essence. We exist first, and then we define ourselves through our choices and actions. There is no human nature that determines what you must be. You are radically free, thrown into existence without a script, without a purpose, without a rule book, and you have to create yourself from scratch, moment by moment, choice by choice. You are, as Sartre puts it, condemned to be free, and that freedom is terrifying. Sartre calls the feeling it produces anguish. It's the vertigo you feel when you realize that nothing is determined, that you could do anything, that every choice is yours and yours alone, and that you can't blame your parents, your upbringing, your genes, your circumstances, or God for what you become. You are entirely responsible for yourself, and most people, Sartre argues, can't handle this. They flee from their freedom into what he calls bad faith, mauvaise foi. They pretend they have no choice. They say, I had to do it, or that's just who I am, or society made me this way. These are lies, Sartre says. Comfortable, necessary lies, but lies. At every moment, you could choose otherwise. The fact that you don't is itself a choice. Simone de Beauvoir, working alongside Sartre but developing her own distinctive philosophy, applied existentialist ideas to the situation of women in one of the most influential books of the 20th century. The Second Sex, published in 1949, argued that one is not born, but rather becomes, a woman. The idea of femininity, the roles and expectations imposed on women, are not natural or inevitable. They are social constructions, products of history and power, and they can be changed. De Beauvoir was applying existentialism's core insight that existence precedes essence to gender. Women don't have a fixed nature any more than anyone else does. They are free to define themselves, and the fact that society has been defining them is a form of oppression. And then there's Albert Camus, who is often grouped with the existentialists, even though he rejected the label. Camus was an Algerian-born French writer, a novelist and essayist of extraordinary clarity and beauty, and his central philosophical concern was what he called the absurd. The absurd, for Camus, is the gap between humanity's desperate desire for meaning and the universe's utter silence on the matter. We want life to make sense. The universe offers no sense. That collision between our need for meaning and the world's refusal to provide it, that's the absurd. And the question Camus poses is simple and devastating. Given the absurd, is life worth living? He wrote a famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, exploring this question. Sisyphus, in Greek mythology, was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for all eternity, only to have it roll back down every time he reached the top. It's a perfect image of meaningless, repetitive suffering, and Camus' extraordinary move is to say that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because his task has meaning, it doesn't, but because Sisyphus can choose to own his situation, to embrace it, to find something in the struggle itself that is worth affirming. The absurd hero doesn't deny the absurdity. He doesn't flee into religion or suicide or self-deception. He faces the void and says yes anyway. He revolts against meaninglessness by continuing to live, fully, passionately, without hope of resolution. And Camus lived his philosophy. During World War II, he was active in the French resistance, editing the underground newspaper Combat. He wrote The Stranger, a novel about a man who seems incapable of performing the expected emotions, who kills an Arab on a beach in Algeria and seems more disturbed by the glare of the sun than by what he's done. It's a deeply unsettling book, and it captures the existentialist mood perfectly. The sense that the social conventions we live by are arbitrary, that the meanings we assign to events are constructed, and that beneath the surface of polite society, there's an abyss of meaninglessness that most people spend their lives carefully not looking into. Camus won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957, at the age of 44, making him one of the youngest laureates ever. He died 3 years later in a car accident, and in the wreckage, they found the manuscript of an unfinished autobiographical novel and an unused train ticket. He'd been planning to take the train, but accepted a ride from his publisher instead. The randomness of that detail, the absolute contingency of it, feels almost too perfectly Camusian to be real. That's a quietly magnificent idea, and it connects to something you might have felt yourself. There are moments in life when everything seems pointless, when the things you've been working toward feel hollow, when you lie in bed at night and wonder what any of it is for. And in those moments, the existentialists and Camus are saying, the meaning isn't out there waiting to be discovered. It's something you create. It's something you build through the act of living itself, through your choices, your relationships, your commitments, your refusal to give up. The universe might be silent, but you don't have to be. Now, let's take a different turn, because there's one more domain of philosophy that's both deeply confusing and surprisingly relevant to your everyday experience, and it brings together almost everything we've been talking about tonight. It's the philosophy of mind, the study of consciousness, and it contains some of the strangest and most stubbornly unresolvable questions in all of human thought. We touched on the mind-body problem earlier, with Descartes. But the modern version of the puzzle, the one that has philosophers and scientists genuinely stumped, is what the Australian philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. And it's worth spending some time with, because it's one of those ideas that, once you really grasp it, changes how you think about your own experience. Here's the hard problem. Science can explain a lot about how the brain works. We can map neural circuits. We can identify which brain regions are involved in vision, hearing, emotion, memory. We can build computational models of information processing. We can explain, at least in principle, why you respond to stimuli the way you do, why you report seeing red when red light hits your retina, why you pull your hand away from a hot stove. All of that, the functional, behavioral, computational side of consciousness, Chalmers calls the easy problems. They're not actually easy in the practical sense. They're enormously complex, but they're easy in the sense that we know the kind of explanation that would solve them. They're scientific problems, amenable to the standard methods of neuroscience and cognitive science. The hard problem is different. The hard problem asks, why is there subjective experience at all? Why does it feel like something to see red? When you look at a sunset, there's something it's like to have that experience. A qualitative character, a redness, a warmth, a beauty. Philosophers call these subjective qualities qualia. And the hard problem is, why do qualia exist? Why does the brain's information processing give rise to any inner experience at all? Why aren't we philosophical zombies, beings that process information and respond to stimuli exactly like normal humans, but without any inner experience, without any lights on inside? Everything would function the same. The behavior would be identical, but there would be nobody home. No subjective experience, no feeling of what it's like to be you. The concept of philosophical zombies is itself a thought experiment, proposed by Chalmers and others, and it's designed to show that consciousness isn't logically entailed by physical processes. If you can conceive of a being that is physically identical to you, atom for atom, but has no inner experience, then consciousness must be something over and above the physical. It must be an additional feature of reality that can't be reduced to physics and neuroscience. And the hard problem has generated some truly exotic proposed solutions. One of the most surprising is panpsychism, the idea that consciousness isn't something that emerges from complex arrangements of matter, but is instead a fundamental feature of matter itself. On this view, every particle, every atom, every electron has some tiny flicker of experiential quality, some proto-consciousness, and human consciousness is what you get when you combine trillions of these tiny experiential units into a sufficiently complex system. It sounds mystical, maybe even crazy, but serious philosophers, including Chalmers himself, have argued that panpsychism deserves serious consideration because it avoids the hard problem entirely. If consciousness is fundamental, like mass or charge, you don't have to explain how it arises from non-conscious matter. It was there all along. Others have proposed that consciousness is an illusion, that there's nothing it's actually like to be you, that the feeling of having subjective experience is itself a kind of cognitive trick, a story your brain tells about itself. Daniel Dennett, the American philosopher, has argued something along these lines, and his position makes a lot of people furious, because it seems to deny the most obvious thing about their existence. You know you're conscious. It's the one thing you can't be wrong about, right? Or can you? Maybe you're wrong about what consciousness is, even if you're not wrong that something is happening when you experience the world. Maybe the something that's happening is very different from what you think it is. Not everyone accepts the zombie argument, of course. Physicalists, who believe that everything that exists is physical, say that philosophical zombies are not genuinely conceivable, or that conceivability doesn't imply possibility. They argue that consciousness will eventually be explained in physical terms, even if we haven't figured out how yet. But the hard problem remains. Even if we had a complete theory of the brain, a theory that told us exactly which neurons fire during which conscious experiences, we'd still face the question of why those neural firings are accompanied by subjective experience. The explanatory gap between physical processes and conscious experience remains unbridged. There's a beautiful thought experiment that illustrates this gap, and it was proposed by the philosopher Frank Jackson in 1982. It's called Mary's Room, and it goes like this. Imagine Mary, a brilliant neuroscientist who has spent her entire life in a black and white room. She has never seen color, but she has studied color exhaustively. She knows everything there is to know about the physics of light, the neurophysiology of color vision, the wavelengths of different colors, how the retina processes them, which brain regions are activated. She has complete physical knowledge of color. Now imagine she steps outside the room for the first time and sees a red rose. Does she learn something new? Intuitively, the answer seems to be yes. She learns what red looks like. She learns what the experience of seeing red is like. And if she learns something new, then her complete physical knowledge was not actually complete. There was something about red, the subjective experience of seeing it, that couldn't be captured by any amount of physical information. And that suggests consciousness involves something beyond the physical. This thought experiment has generated an enormous amount of debate. Physicalists have several responses. Some deny that Mary learns something new. Others say she gains a new ability, the ability to recognize red, but not new knowledge about the world. Others argue that the thought experiment is misleading because you can't really imagine what it would mean to know everything about color while never having seen it. The debate continues, and it's one of those wonderful, infuriating cases where the thought experiment is so vivid and so intuitive that it's hard to shake, even if you're intellectually committed to physicalism. And then there's the Chinese room, which attacks the problem from a completely different angle. This thought experiment was proposed by John Searle in 1980, and it's aimed at the question of whether a computer could ever truly understand anything. Here's the setup. Imagine you're locked in a room. People outside the room slide pieces of paper under the door with Chinese characters written on them. You don't speak Chinese. You don't understand a word of it. But you have a huge book of rules, an instruction manual that tells you how to respond. For every possible combination of Chinese characters that comes in, the book tells you which characters to write back. You follow the rules, scribble the appropriate response, and slide it back under the door. From outside, it looks like the room understands Chinese. The responses are perfect. But you, inside the room, understand nothing. You're just manipulating symbols according to rules. You have syntax, but no semantics. You process the form, but not the meaning. Searle's point is that this is exactly what a computer does. A computer manipulates symbols according to rules. It's a very fancy Chinese room, and no matter how fast it runs, no matter how complex the rules, it never actually understands anything. It produces the right outputs, but there's no comprehension, no meaning, no consciousness behind the processing. If this argument is right, then artificial intelligence, no matter how sophisticated, can never achieve genuine understanding. It can simulate understanding, but simulation isn't the real thing, any more than a computer simulation of a rainstorm gets anything wet. Now, many AI researchers and philosophers of mind disagree with Searle. They argue that understanding might emerge from sufficiently complex symbol processing, that the individual symbols don't understand Chinese, but the system as a whole might. That Searle is confusing the micro level, where no understanding occurs, with the macro level, where understanding might emerge the way wetness emerges from individual water molecules that aren't themselves wet. This is the system's reply. And the debate between Searle and his critics remains one of the liveliest in contemporary philosophy. And you know, lying here, thinking about all of this, there's something oddly comforting about how unresolved it all is. You might expect, after 2,500 years of human beings thinking as hard as they can about these questions, that we'd have definitive answers by now. We don't, not for most of them. The nature of consciousness, the existence of free will, the foundation of morality, the meaning of life, the relationship between mind and body, the reliability of our knowledge of the world, these remain genuinely open questions. And that might sound like a failure. 25 centuries and we still don't know? But I don't think it's a failure. I think it's something else entirely. I think the value of philosophy was never primarily in the answers. It was in the quality of the questions. It was in the way that asking these questions forces you to think more carefully, more honestly, more humbly about the things you take for granted. Every belief you hold, when you push on it hard enough, opens onto a landscape of complexity and uncertainty that you didn't know was there. And learning to navigate that landscape, learning to hold your beliefs with appropriate tentativeness, learning to follow an argument where it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable, that's a skill. It's maybe the most important skill there is, in a world full of people who are absolutely certain about things they haven't really thought about. Socrates was right. The unexamined life isn't worth living, but the examined life, the life of genuine philosophical inquiry, is also unsettling, because the more you examine, the less certain you become, and certainty is comfortable, and uncertainty is not. The courage to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some of the deepest questions about your existence might not have answers, or might have answers that change as you change. That's a kind of wisdom. It's the wisdom Socrates claimed to have, the wisdom of knowing what you don't know. And here's the thing that ties this all together, the thread that runs from Thales standing on the shore in Miletus to the neuroscientist puzzling over consciousness in a modern laboratory. It's the conviction that asking why is the most human thing you can do. Animals don't ask why. They eat, they mate, they flee from danger, they sleep. They don't wonder about the nature of justice, or worry about whether they have free will, or contemplate the possibility that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to their suffering. Only you do that. Only human beings look up at the stars and ask what it all means, knowing that the stars don't care about the question. And yet we keep asking. We can't help it. It's in our nature, if we have a nature, which the existentialists would dispute. From the pre-Socratics wondering what everything is made of, to Plato trying to see past the shadows on the cave wall, to Descartes sitting alone in a cold room doubting everything, to Hume pulling the rug out from under causation, to Kant trying to put it back, to Nietzsche staring into the abyss, to Sartre insisting on your radical freedom, to Chalmers wondering why anything feels like anything at all. The story of philosophy is the story of human beings refusing to accept the world at face value, refusing to stop asking, refusing to settle. That's what you've been listening to tonight. Not a set of answers, a set of questions. The deepest, most persistent, most confusing questions that human beings have ever asked. And they're your questions now, whether you realized it or not. They've been your questions all along. Because every time you wonder whether you're making the right choice, you're doing ethics. Every time you question whether something is really true, you're doing epistemology. Every time you lie awake wondering what the point of it all is, you're doing existential philosophy. Every time you marvel at the fact that you're conscious, that there's something it's like to be you, you're standing right at the edge of the hardest problem in philosophy. And the beautiful thing about these questions is that they don't require a degree or a library or a cold room in Germany. They just require a willingness to wonder, a willingness to not know, a willingness to follow a thought into the dark and see where it goes. So let that settle over you now. Let the names blur. Let the arguments soften. Thales and his water, Socrates and his questions, Plato and his cave, Descartes and his doubt, Hume and his billiard balls, Kant and his lenses, Nietzsche and his abyss, Sartre and his freedom, Camus and his boulder. They were all, in their different ways, trying to do the same thing. They were trying to wake up, to see clearly, to understand what it means to be alive in a universe that doesn't explain itself. And now, you get to do the opposite. You get to let go. You've spent tonight thinking about some of the hardest things human beings have ever thought about, and your brain has been quietly working on all of it, turning it over, connecting pieces, letting ideas settle into the places where they fit. The questions don't need answers tonight. They've been open for millennia. They can wait until morning. And right now, the most philosophical thing you can do is exactly what you're doing. Lying still, breathing slowly, letting consciousness do what it does best when you stop trying to direct it. Drifting, dissolving, becoming soft and formless, like Anaximander's boundless, like the space between thoughts, like the silence that exists before the question is asked. The universe has no obligation to make sense, but it made you, and you make sense of it, and that's enough, more than enough. Sleep now. The questions will still be there tomorrow, patient and eternal, and unanswerable, and beautiful, waiting for you whenever you're ready.